Hello and welcome to Heritage Foundation. I'm Andrew Parks, the Program Coordinator for Lectures and Seminars. Thank you all for joining us today at our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. For those who are watching online, you're free to submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those attending in-house, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone to silence cell phones. Hosting today's program is Derek Morgan. He's the Vice President of Domestic and Economic Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody to Heritage. You are really in for a treat today. Dr. Tevi Troy has written a fun and substantial book about popular culture and the White House. Of course, it's what Jefferson read, Ike watched, and Obama tweeted. And we were talking outside, is tweeting more up to date than texting or vice versa? I don't know. We can have that discussion maybe in the Q&A time. But from Cicero to Snooki, from parchment to iPhones, American culture has changed a lot in the last 200 years, both in content and in delivery. But one thing hasn't changed. The President of the United States is still the only politician elected by the people of every state and the District of Columbia. Everyone else represents only one state or one district, but the President represents the whole country. We all have a connection with him, and it's important for us that he connect with us as well. As Dr. Troy notes, modern presidents must know common culture without being debased by it. He does a great job of tracing the developments of culture and technology and the White House's sometimes skillful and sometimes not so skillful interaction with culture. He tells the story about the masterful use of culture by John F. Kennedy, for example, and then a few of Richard Nixon's missteps. That was fun reading. He also talks about Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower as pioneers of using new technology of radio and television. And I was telling Tevi earlier, it's quite appropriate that we're having this event on the 41st anniversary of the first cell phone call in the United States. It was made on the Dynatac, a brick-like monstrosity made by Motorola. And we've seen wireless technology advance quite a bit since then, haven't we? We now have the computing power, more computing power in our hands than NASA did to put a man on the moon. It's really quite extraordinary. But no matter how much technology advances, Tevi, I think we'll always need a historian to document those changes. And we're fortunate to have a distinguished historian with us today. The Honorable Tevi Troy is president of the newly formed American Health Policy Institute. And from 2007 to 2009, Dr. Troy was the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the second command there, and the Chief Operating Officer of the largest civilian department in the federal government, with about 67,000 employees. After receiving his PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas, Dr. Troy dedicated a dozen years to public service, working in senior levels in the House of Representatives, the Senate, executive agencies, and the White House. Before going to HHS, this is where I got to know Tevi, was when he served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. And then immediately after leaving government service, Dr. Troy became a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he remains an adjunct fellow. Dr. Troy's first book was Intellectuals in the American Presidency, Philosophers, Jesters, or Technicians. And it was a study on the impact that intellectuals have had on presidential administrations. Dr. Troy appears frequently on television and radio to discuss health care and other issues. And he's also a contributing editor at Washingtonian. When he's not busy with his day jobs, Dr. Troy and his wife, Cammie, are plenty busy at home with 4 children under the age of 13. Please join me in welcoming Tevi Troy.
Thank you, Derek, for that nice introduction and for helping set up this event. You know, you mentioned that the president is the only official elected by all 50 states, but the truth is, it's ironic given who you used to work for. It's also the vice president, and that's where we first met each other. But you also mentioned the 41st anniversary of the cell phone. The truth is that before cell phones, we had car phones, and one of the first people to have a car phone was actually Lyndon Johnson. And he used to lord it over everybody that he had this car phone, and he would call people and tell everyone he was calling from the car. So one time, Mike Mansfield, a fellow senator, he got his car phone installed. And he so excitedly called Lyndon Johnson and said, Lyndon, he calls him in the car, and he calls Lyndon and says, I know you're in your car. I'm calling you from my car phone. I'm really excited about this. And Lyndon Johnson says, hold on there, Mike. My other phone is ringing. So Johnson was always ready to one-up people. But I'd like to start my talk today with a quote from a book, a great book, the good book, the Bible. And the quote is, of the making of books, there is no end. And I mention this because not only because do authors have trouble coming to closure on their books. You know, they say that an author writes a book that they wish they could find in the library but couldn't. But once you get started, it's a labor of love, and you're working on it, and you know you have a deadline. And I'd like to acknowledge my editor, Tom Spence, and publicist Aaron Hafter are both here. But I had a deadline. I had to get the book done, and I had to hand it in. But in this particular case, with this book about presidents and pop culture, it was so hard for me to close it because, thanks to our current president, President Obama, this story never ends. The story of presidential interaction with pop culture goes on every day, and every day there's more stuff that, had the book still been open, I would be adding to the book and adding to Tom's burden. So let's just go this very week. President Obama was crowing a little bit about the Affordable Care Act, and he's talking about Republican alternative plans, and he said that they were like the movie Groundhog Day. It's just the same old stuff over and over and over again. And then Politico had this fascinating piece about the pop culture plan to sell the Affordable Care Act, and in this, President Obama went on a show called the Mad Hatta Show, Hatta, and he was briefed that you're supposed to call this particular DJ fellow Mr. Mad when you're on the radio with him. And when he was briefed on this, Obama's reaction was, I think we're okay on this because I doubt Mr. Mad is going to ask me about the details of the CBO report. Probably a good guess. Going back the week before, he was on the Ellen Show, and he was asked by Ellen to dance. He said he wouldn't do it, but he did talk about life in Washington. He said it was a bunch of boring men in gray suits making decisions. And then even before that, he had this famous appearance on the Between Two Ferns show with Zach Galifianakis, where they had a pretty feisty exchange. I don't know how many of you saw it, although I know a lot of those 20-something types that they were targeting did see it. It had huge viewership. And in the exchange, after a couple of minutes of repartee back and forth, at one point, Zach Galifianakis kind of rolls his eyes and says, okay, I guess you're here to sell something. Do you want to sell it? And President Obama started talking about the Affordable Care Act. And Zach Galifianakis says to the President of the United States, oh yeah, isn't that thing that doesn't work? And then President Obama responds that it does work, in his opinion, and he starts talking about the Affordable Care Act for a few moments. And then Zach Galifianakis says, is this what they mean by the drone program? Which was funny, I admit, but it was a little cheeky, I thought, in front of the sitting President of the United States. However, on the other hand, the President of the United States did go and put himself in that forum, knowing what that forum is about. And if you've watched any of the previous videos, you know that's what the host does. But this very active, very conscious effort to sell the Affordable Care Act through pop culture venues really echoes President Obama's 2012 campaign strategy, where he used pop culture venues to push his reelection against Mitt Romney. Now, granted, he kind of had an easy opponent because when Mitt Romney was making pop culture references, they were usually to shows like Seinfeld or movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Both fine examples of programming, but relatively dated. Ferris Bueller dates back to the 80s, and Seinfeld is a show from the 90s. And Obama was much more up to date. So, for example, he went on the Pimp with a Limp show in Florida to talk about his reelection prospects. He went on a New Mexico DJ program where he talked about what his favorite superpower would be. He went on many late-night talk shows, Letterman, Leno, etc., and he was the first president to go on some of these shows as president. Now, some people always say, well, what about Bill Clinton and the Arsenio Hall show? That happened to be when he put on the sunglasses and the saxophone. That was before he was president. He was still governor at the time. Nixon also famously went on Laugh-In, again, when he was not yet president. He was running for president. And he was supposed to say the show's signature line, "Sock it to me." And instead he said, "Sock it to me?" So he kind of, he blew his appearance on pop culture. But President Obama was very conscious and strategic in this effort. And in fact, there's a recent book out by Richard Wolff about the 2012 campaign, where he said that when President Obama went on these pop culture venues, they were doing it very consciously because they were trying to reach specific groups of relatively uninformed voters who they expected not to come out to the polls, and they wanted to encourage them to come out to vote. And there was kind of a supposition by the White House press corps that when he was going on these soft media venues, that he was doing it to avoid tough questions. And the truth is, again, according to this book, is they found the questions on these pop culture venues somewhat harder to deal with. They said they could handle David Gregory because they knew the kind of questions he would ask, but they never knew what any of these pop culture entertainment types would ask. So it was actually putting the president in a position where, I don't want to say he got tough substantive questions, because that really didn't happen, although David Letterman asked him the size of the debt, and he professed not to know it, which I found shocking. But the idea of this was put yourself out there in venues where you could potentially have to say something or have to respond to something embarrassing or be in a potentially embarrassing situation, but do it in a specific purpose to reach certain targeted voters that you were trying to get. And so President Obama has, I think, been very skillful at his recognition of the disaggregation of our current culture and how we're broken up into different bits. You don't have any people watching any one show today like you did in the past. So in 1980 or so, when MASH went off the air, 106 million people watched that finale. Now this fall, with great fanfare and attention and a lot of Twitter love, Breaking Bad went off the air. I mean, you couldn't not know that Breaking Bad was going off the air. That finale got more viewers than the show had ever gotten, by 50% more than any previous episode. It got 10 million viewers. So the audience is no longer collected in any one place, and a smart politician, and President Obama is a smart politician, has to go and find the audiences where they are. And this recognition of pop culture memes making references to movies like Groundhog Day shows a kind of ability to connect with the audience to show that you understand their concerns. And in fact, if you look at the polls after the election, the exit polls said that Romney and Obama were neck and neck on every major issue, on healthcare, on the economy, and on issues where you didn't usually expect a Republican to be neck and neck with a Democrat, on education. But the one issue where Obama crushed Romney was this question of understands the concerns of people like me. And it was something like 80-20 that Obama won on that question. So by going out there in the places where people are watching, where people are taking in their information, and speaking to them in voices that they understood, he was very successful politically. Now, in my book, I go way further back, and I show that presidents have been using culture to inform themselves, to entertain themselves, and to relate to audiences for over 200 years. This goes all the way back to our founding fathers. Now, of course, our founding fathers did not have the options of Twitter and YouTube and Between Two Ferns and TVs and even microphones like I am privileged to have here today. But the two ways to reach people back in those days, and the two ways that presidents received information and entertainment, were both ones that exist today, although they have more competition. They were the printed word, or books, and live entertainment, or which you're hopefully getting right now. And our founders took advantage of them. So, for example, books were very, very expensive in the colonies in those days. A first edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776 in the colonies cost the equivalent of 615 of today's dollars. That's a lot of money. And today that could buy you an iPad, and an iPad could store about 160,000 books. So we have so much more access to information today than we did then. But nevertheless, our founders, despite these costs, engaged in reading, and they took in books, and they collected huge libraries. Jefferson, for example, had a library of 6,000 books, and that library became the basis for the Library of Congress's original collection. Adams, somewhat more modestly, had a collection of 3,000 books. And they read these books, and the books were expensive enough to be an investment, and they saw them as an investment. They were investing in ideas, and they had letters where they went back and forth about the ideas they saw in these books, and they discussed the ideas at the dinner table. And in fact, at one point, Jefferson appeared envious of Adams because Adams, even though he had a smaller library, appeared to read more. He said, "Dear sir, how I envy you," because Adams actually took in more books. But the books they read had a real relevance to us today, because the ideas they found in those books helped shape the revolution that took the U.S. away from England and helped start this great country. And in fact, if you look at, for example, the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson had the pen on, and when he talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is clearly echoing John Locke and the notion of life, liberty, and property. And so the ideas that informed the revolution were ideas that the founders took in from not only the European Enlightenment, but also from classical Greek and Roman eras. And so George Washington, for example, was inspired by the story of Cato and his struggles against to maintain Roman republicanism against the tyranny of what he saw as the tyranny of Caesar. And he actually had the play Addison's Cato shown to the troops at Valley Forge in that winter of 1777, 1778 to maintain their morale at a different time. And he knew that they would understand the significance of a play like that and the references that they were making in showing a play like that. So the founders, I would say overall, had this vision of enlightened leaders presiding over an educated populace. And it was that vision that animated how they structured this country, but also how they served as leaders. And that vision, I argue in the book, was challenged by two things in our history. The first one came in the 19th century when we started to realize, our leaders started to recognize, that maybe the population wasn't, may have been educated. In fact, the literacy rates in the U.S. were higher in the colonial era and throughout the 19th century than in many of our similar European countries. But there was also a raucous and common aspect to small d democracy that led to people who wanted to get elected not being these sort of larger-than-life figures who were enlightened figures who were just greatly educated people, not emphasizing that aspect of their personalities, but also emphasizing their common man nature. And so the first president who really recognized this, I argue in the book, was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson ran twice, actually, against John Quincy Adams. The first time he lost, even though Jackson had a plurality of the popular vote and the electoral vote. But Quincy Adams won because the election was thrown his way in the House of Representatives, thanks to Henry Clay, was known as the corrupt bargain. But very quickly, it was clear that Jackson had captured the imagination of the populace. And in the 1828 election, the rematch election, Jackson won handily. And he becomes president. And while he is president, he is offered an honorary degree from Harvard. Now, John Quincy Adams, who I argue in the book may have been our best prepared person to be president, knew Greek and Latin, liked to translate Greek and Latin texts into English, was very well read, spoke multiple languages, had been minister to other countries, had been Secretary of State. He was prepared for leadership. He was also a graduate of Harvard and somewhat mortified to see that Andrew Jackson was going to be getting this honorary degree from the august institution from which Adams had graduated. And he even complained to the president of Harvard about this. Now, he was able to do this because the president of Harvard happened to be his cousin, Josiah Quincy. But Josiah Quincy wouldn't take his complaints. He wasn't so interested, and he allowed the honorary degree recipient to come to Harvard and get the degree. And at that ceremony, when the language of Harvard was Latin at the time, and the students there addressed Jackson in Latin, Jackson would have none of it. And he said, of Latin I only know three words, e pluribus unum, showing that he had this common man touch. He wasn't going to be one of these fusty old Latin speakers. He was going to be a president for the common man. And I argue that from that point, presidents have recognized that you do need some John Quincy Adams in you in order to govern effectively, but you need a lot of Andrew Jackson in order to get elected and to become president. And so this common man thing became a recurring theme in American politics, and we saw that throughout the 19th century. And then this enlightened leader model was challenged further in the 20th century by the rise of technology. Now, the first big technology to emerge in the 20th century that addressed this issue was radio. Radio allowed presidents to amplify their voices and their reach far beyond the rooms in front of which they were appearing, or the crowds in front of which they were appearing. You know, Andrew Jackson, who I just talked about, at his inauguration, he spoke to 10,000 people. It's pretty impressive, but they all had to be there in front of him. I guess he had a good voice and could project. When Warren Harding gave the first speech by a president over the radio, and he was nowhere near the politician that Andrew Jackson was, he reached 125,000 people. The reach was so much greater. And within 10 years, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave his inaugural address, he was reaching tens of millions of people on the radio. Now, as many people know, FDR was quite skillful in his use of radio. We all know about the fireside chats, but the truth is that his use of radio predated his presidency. And in fact, he probably wouldn't have become president if he wasn't so skillful in his use of radio. At the Democratic conventions of 1924 and 1928, he spoke, and in his speeches, he had this central insight that he wasn't just speaking to the people in the room in front of him, but indeed he was speaking to the larger national audience that could hear him over the radio. And he tailored his remarks for that purpose. And he himself realized the reach of radio when in 1932 he did secure the nomination. And he called his mother, like a good boy, to tell her that he had won the nomination. And she said to him, "I already know that. I heard it over the radio." So she was a step ahead of him on radio, but he was a step ahead of everybody else. And as president, we do know about the fireside chats, which I mentioned. And Roosevelt took those fireside chats very seriously. First of all, people have this image today of Roosevelt just appearing on the radio all the time and giving these regular addresses. It was nothing like that. He only appeared 2 to 3 times a year on radio and carefully marshaled those appearances for maximum effect. And he was very worried about the danger of being overexposed by appearing on the radio too often. And so he, in fact, even thought that Winston Churchill overexposed himself by appearing too often on the radio in Britain. Now, of course, Churchill in Britain had to deal with the Battle of Britain and German planes flying over his city and bombing it. So he had another kind of problem to deal with. But nevertheless, it is instructive that, that Roosevelt thought that about Churchill. And when he gave these speeches on the radio, he carefully prepared for them. He had a special spray that he would spritz in his mouth before he went on. He had a slight gap in his teeth that he would fill in with a false tooth, because when he had the gap in his teeth, there was a slight whistle that would emit when he spoke, and he didn't want that to come over the radio. And when he had papers in front of him with the speeches, but he had the paper typed on a very special form of paper that didn't rustle, it didn't make that rustling noise when he switched pages, so that people may have thought that he was speaking off the cuff when in fact he was speaking from a very carefully prepared text. And in that carefully prepared text, he went through them with his speechwriters, and he would cross off any $5 or $10 words, because he wanted the people to know that even though he was this wealthy Harvard-born patrician, he was one of them. He was one of the people. He took this so far that when he had the Queen of England come visit, he made sure that the food item on the menu was hot dogs, to show again that he was a man of the people. Now, the technology continued to improve, and one of the reasons we know about Roosevelt's mastery of the media so much of the radio so much, is that after he died, a new technology had emerged, television. So no president really had to master radio after that point to the way that Roosevelt did. But TV came about, and Dwight Eisenhower actually happened to be the first president whose entire administration coincided with the TV era. It was very new and fresh under Truman, but the numbers were growing significantly under Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was quite revolutionary in his use of TV. For example, he was the first president to bring in an outside Hollywood advisor, the actor Robert Montgomery, to advise him on how to speak on TV and how to appear on TV. He also was the first president to have televised news conferences. They were later edited. They weren't live press conferences. That was an innovation that would come later, but he was the first one to have those televised news conferences to get the word out to the American people. And the most famous words of the Eisenhower administration, the military-industrial complex, come from his televised farewell address to the nation. So he knew what he was doing on TV, but he also liked to watch TV. TV was something that he found appealing, and in fact, he watched so much TV in the White House that one of the White House ushers complained at one point at the degree to which the social schedule in the White House was set by the TV schedule. Kind of hard to imagine. Actually, not so hard to imagine today in the Obama administration, but because President Obama, as we'll see, does watch a lot of TV. But nevertheless, this was a big deal. But you've got to have some forgiveness, I guess, for Eisenhower for this, because back in those days, there was no VCR, there was no DVD, there was no DVR. If you missed that episode of I Love Lucy, you were out of luck. That was it. You missed it. And in fact, there was an episode of I Love Lucy that competed with Eisenhower's inauguration. And not only an episode of I Love Lucy, but the particular episode in which Lucy gives birth to little Ricky. This was a huge phenomenon. And indeed, it got more viewers than Eisenhower's inauguration. Something that Eisenhower remembered for a long time and was kind of frosted about. And in fact, 10 years later, he saw Lucille Ball herself. He was no longer president, but he saw her, and she was with a 10-year-old boy. And she said, "Is this the little boy that took away all that attention from my inauguration?" Now, the truth is, and Lucy had to explain that little Ricky on the show was an actor, and this was her actual son, little Ricky himself. But the point remains that Eisenhower kept that grudge for a long time, and it really stuck with him. He was quite aware of how he appeared on TV and whether people were watching, and if people were watching something else, he knew that as well. He also loved movies, by the way, and he particularly loved Westerns. It was his favorite type of movie, and one of the, another one of the White House ushers said that they had a hard time finding Westerns that Eisenhower actually hadn't previously seen. But he used these Westerns and movies in general in diplomacy. So when Nikita Khrushchev comes and visits and is going to have an evening with Eisenhower, Eisenhower offers up Westerns and asks if Khrushchev had watched them previously. And Khrushchev responds that he indeed has watched Westerns, not only watched them, but he watched them with Joseph Stalin himself. Well, Eisenhower was a little surprised by this, and Khrushchev explained that they would watch these Westerns together, after which Stalin would denounce them as imperialist, capitalist, Western, claptrap, and nonsense. And afterwards, Stalin would say, "Let's watch another Western." So this whole notion that we saw in the late 80s, early 90s, that the Western culture was winning the Cold War was doing so much earlier than perhaps we thought. But after Eisenhower, obviously came Kennedy, and I mentioned that Kennedy is Kennedy was very well known for his use of TV, and he was even more revolutionary than Eisenhower, and was a great TV candidate. In fact, the 1960 debate, which was not only the first televised debate, but it was the first presidential debate in American history, period. That had never happened before. And at that debate, Nixon was actually kind of cocky. He thought that he was very well suited to debate on television. He had a very good feeling about his own use of television from the 1952 Checkers speech, when he saved his vice presidential nomination by going on and appealing to the nation and asking that Eisenhower not kick him off the ticket for what appeared to be some financial improprieties. And in that speech, he famously referred to a gift that he got. He said, "We did get one gift. It was a gift of a dog named Checkers, and my daughters love that dog and do what you ought to me, but we're not giving up that dog." Anyway, it was a big hit. That speech is a little mawkish to us today, I suppose, but nevertheless, it was quite successful. And so Nixon was quite optimistic about his prospects against Kennedy on TV. He also thought that he was more substantive on the issues, having been vice president for 8 years. But Eisenhower knew better. He actually warned Nixon not to debate Kennedy on TV, advice to which Nixon obviously did not listen. And many of us know the story that when that debate took place, Nixon won among people who listened on the radio. But at this point, TV now had a 90% penetration rate. And people who saw on TV and saw the handsome, dapper, debonair, very smooth, very cool and collected Kennedy against the sweaty, not fully shaven, and kind of jittery Nixon, clearly thought Kennedy was the winner. And Kennedy was so cognizant of how helpful and how useful TV was to him that after the election he saw TV and he remarked, "We wouldn't have had a prayer without that gadget." So TV was quite helpful. And so presidents started to realize that TV was an important part of the equation in how you get elected. And in 1968, when Nixon ran again and was successful this time, there's that famous book, The Selling of the President, by Joe McGinnis, who recently died. And in it talks about Nixon's relationship with Roger Ailes, this TV wunderkind who had worked on the Mike Douglas show. And Nixon appeared on the Mike Douglas show and made some disparaging comment about TV, and Ailes said to him, "No, if you don't understand TV, you won't be able to get elected." And so Nixon brought him on as a TV advisor, which is what launched Ailes's political career. And Nixon was quite successful. And what he did was he went around the country and he had these little events where he would have kind of a hand-picked audience, and he'd say, "I'm going to take questions from the crowd." And even though it was a pro-Republican crowd, the fact that Nixon was in there mixing it up made him look good, and he made him look natural, which was not an easy thing with Nixon. I mean, not everything they tried with Nixon worked. So I mentioned the laughing thing, which was a bit of a bomb. They also tried to have Nixon walk along the beach at one point to humanize him, and he famously kept on his wingtips and his suit, and it didn't work at all. So, but in any event, the use of TV became an important tool for presidents, and the better you were at it, the more likely you were to get elected. And in fact, one of the favorite presidents of the Heritage Foundation. Ronald Reagan was brilliant at his use of TV. In fact, his media advisor said, Reagan, he always hit his marks. He knew what to do. He was a professional. He knew how to perform. And there's a great story that at one point, Reagan and Nancy were doing a TV spot together. And Nancy was kind of second-guessing Ronnie and saying, well, do it this way, do it that way. And Reagan looked at her and said, Nancy, I have done this before. And Nancy was a little irked, and she left the room, and they did the spot, and Reagan looked great, as he always did. So the use of media was an important tool of presidents. But this also gave rise to a new phenomenon, especially with the rise of cable and more programming and 24/7. This phenomenon, what I call in the book, of when you are president, you don't just watch TV, you are TV. You are the product that people see. In fact, you're the most commented person, for example, on the late night talk shows. And studies have shown that in almost every year, the President of the United States is the butt of more jokes than any other character or figure in America. And I say almost every year. There was an exception to that recently when President Obama was not the most frequent target of jokes. And the Wall Street Journal had an analysis of this. Is right in the beginning of his term in 2008-2009 period, and they said that the reason that they quoted a comedy writer on this saying the reason that they didn't make jokes on President Obama to the same degree that they have about other presidents is because the halo was too bright. And in fact, they gave a list. They gave an example of the types of jokes that they did say about President Obama. They said they were kind of very soft jokes that weren't be too damaging. So there was the joke that Jon Stewart had, where he said that. President Obama is going to extend his Middle East trip by a day so that he can go to Bethlehem and visit the manger where he was born. So not exactly cutting-edge humor or biting humor against President Obama. But this notion of when you are president, you don't just watch TV, you are TV, became very real in the Clinton administration, when Clinton obviously had the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And in that scandal, it was everywhere. And in fact, Peter Baker, in his book about the scandal, talks about how the downloading of the Starr report was the first shared internet experience that we had as a nation. People realized you didn't have to just watch Dan Rather and CBS News to find out what was in the Starr report. You could read it for yourself, and people did it in droves. Thousands and thousands of people downloaded this document, and I remember their servers breaking down because they didn't have the capacity that we have today. But it was a really big deal. It was everywhere. But it was so pervasive that it got Clinton a little down, understandably. At one point, they decided to go and take a little break. And so Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Terry McAuliffe, who's now governor of Virginia, but was a longtime Clinton fundraiser and friend, they went away on a little vacation. And in the evening on this vacation, they decided to watch a little TV to relax. And Hillary had the remote control, and every channel she's turning to has something about the scandal. So if you think about the news shows, obviously are all about it. The comics are making hay about it. They're having a field day. Even shows like sitcoms can make references to it, or they can even ad-lib comments. So it was just a constant thing. You couldn't get away from this scandal, and it was very frustrating. And so finally, after flipping through just about every option, Hillary found one option that didn't have it. It was ESPN. There was nothing on the scandal on that channel. It was not Hillary's favorite channel by a long shot, but for that night it worked. And McAuliffe, in his book, tells this story about that vacation where the White House stewards come around and they say, would anybody like some wine? And Hillary says no, and Bill says no, and McAuliffe says, I'll take the bottle, please. You can't really blame him. But this notion of TV bringing the president into our homes and into our lives is something that I said earlier that President Obama has been very successful at. And even though the audience is disaggregated, even though things have changed a great deal, he recognizes how to find the audience members, potential voters, where he needs to find them. And I argue in the book that a lot of this stems from his own immersion in pop culture as a young man. In fact, not just a young man, but a young boy. And in his own memoir, he talks about when he was in Hawaii, he went to the elite school of Punahou, so a very, very top-notch school. And he says that his average day after leaving Punahou went as follows, and I quote this whole paragraph in the book, so you see it's directly from him, I'm not shading it, but he basically says that I would leave school and I would go to the comic book store to see what new comic books were available. And then I would go home and I would watch cartoons. And then I would watch sitcom reruns. And then my grandfather and I would watch primetime TV until Johnny Carson came on, at which point my grandfather would kick me out of the room so he could watch the Carson monologue. And then he would go to bed listening to top 40 music on the radio until he went to sleep. Now that is a pretty heavily pop culture immersed childhood. And for those parents out there, I would not recommend that as a parenting technique. But nevertheless, President Obama clearly took in a lot of pop culture at a young age, and it has informed his views on many things, not just the entertainment of the shows themselves, but on how to reach an audience and what appeals and what are common reference points. And so while I would argue that it is not the best way to raise a child, perhaps it does have some advantages in raising a politician who can see that there are ways that you appeal to audiences, and there are ways that you can speak so that audiences will understand your references. Because, for example, when Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address made that 7 years ago reference, was a biblical allusion that he knew people at the time would recognize. Today, you make a biblical allusion, you can't be so sure that people recognize it. But you make a TV joke, as President Obama did in the State of the Union address when he mentioned Mad Men, and that becomes the most tweeted moment of an otherwise forgettable State of the Union address. So President Obama's own immersion in pop culture as a child has helped him become a political leader. And again, I don't recommend this as a parenting strategy, and to President Obama's credit, he didn't remain a couch potato his whole life, and in fact there was a time where he kind of got up off the couch, and he talks in his memoir about how he started reading a lot more, especially in late high school and going into college. As president, he still watches a huge amount of TV though. He's talked about the shows that he's liked, including Breaking Bad and Mad Men and The Wire and Boardwalk Empire, and in fact, not long ago, and this was another part I would have added to the book had the book still been open, like my earlier, my opening suggested, but he met with the CEO of HBO, and he asked him for advance copies of the shows True Detective and Game of Thrones so he can get a heads up on watching those shows. So we've had a lot of changes technologically throughout our history that have led to this situation where you have presidents who are need to appear to be far more engaged with the popular culture. And I would also argue that perhaps in some ways we were better off when we were focused on books. I'm no Luddite, and I take advantage of all these technologies, but maybe there is something to be said about presidents reading a little more and being a little more immersed in the great ideas that have driven Western civilization. And I kind of close the book with a question, which is, we clearly have, presidents and the rest of us, have so many more options today for what we take in for education and entertainment. Remember I said that initially you had the choices of live entertainment or the written word. Well, now there are so many more options. There's a whole panoply of possibilities. But with all of these other options, the question is, are we and our presidents making better choices? Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tevi. Yeah, we have time for some questions. I've got one while you're thinking of yours. So you have a stat in your book about the average TV intake was 28 hours a week, something like that. And you talked a little bit about overexposure as well, but with Franklin Roosevelt that he thought 2 or 3 times a year was about right. But Obama's clearly on a lot more channels, but is that somewhat ameliorated by the fact that there's so many different channels and outlets that maybe he's not as in danger of overexposure, or do you think that he is perhaps overexposed in media?
It's an excellent question, Derek, and I think overexposure is actually a problem. And I talked a little bit earlier about his 2012 campaign, and there's one stat I had in the book that he had over 24 appearances in soft media venues. When I say soft media venues, I was talking about some of these earlier, or the Young Letterman or Leno or The View, which he's got on 6 times, or The Pimp with a Limp, or the New Mexico DJ, or just a whole host of these different shows. And he went on them, and it was very successful in terms of helping get him elected and getting out his voters to the polls. There's a statistic that in the 2008 election, the electorate was 18% young voters, which was a record-breaking number. Nobody had ever brought out that high a percentage of young voters before. And the pollsters in 2012 didn't expect anyone to be able to hit that mark again. And there was a lot of griping about the Romney campaign pollsters that, oh boy, those guys don't know what they're talking about. They called it wrong. Well, they didn't call it wrong. They adjusted the electorate according to historical expectations. And they did not expect Obama to be able to hit that 18% mark of youth voters again, because in fact, and if you look at the 2010 election, the youth voters dropped significantly to around 10 or 12%. But in fact, in that 2012 election, he not only hit the 18% mark, he went higher. 19% of the electorate was youth voters. So he was very successful in getting his voters out in that election. So that's the plus side of this kind of overexposure. On the other hand, there is a challenge and there is a problem, and I think it's both a short-term problem and a long-term problem. In the short term, President Obama in 2013 had to deal with this issue of Syria and this very serious and problematic issue of Syria using chemical weapons. And what does he do? He goes this traditional route. He goes on the TV screen and he appears on this, he asks all the networks to carry him and he shows and he gives this speech about Syria and how we need to address this issue. And this speech, by all accounts, left and right, everybody agreed, landed with a big thud. There was just no interest in what he had to say on this subject. And I wonder, and I don't know if it's provable by social science data, but I wonder if his overexposure in the 2012 in all these fun media outlets led to a situation where when he goes and talks on a more traditional media outlet about a bummer of an issue, so to speak, I mean, there's this tragic use of chemical weapons in Syria, makes it harder for him to reach the American people because maybe they tuned out and maybe are not listening. So that's the short-term problem. The long-term problem is, what does this mean for future presidents? Does this mean a diminution of gravitas and seriousness and the respect with which we hold the office? Do we just expect the president to be another one of the many entertainers we have out there? Or do we expect something more and greater and more removed from our president? And we can't know the answer to that question yet either, but we'll see what happens after 2016. Good question.
We go here on middle section.
Hi, my name's Dave Price. Two very quick questions. You really can't compare baseball players over eras like Babe Ruth or Mickey Mantle. But you spent time with these presidents, and given the conditions they were in, who would you say was the best use of pop culture? I mean, obviously we'd say Obama now because it's there, but as you look back, we didn't have it. And then the second question, which kind of dovetails on your last remark, given this visual, can an ugly man or woman with a lisp ever be elected again to a national office in that sense where the ideas are secondary to the persona?
You say again, did we have an ugly man with a lisp? I mean, Lincoln wasn't so good looking, but.
That's what I'm saying. He got elected pre-Twitter, pre-video. Right. That's my question. I mean, now is the image more important than substance to get elected? That would be my question.
Look, it's clearly very hard to get elected if you're unattractive. And I think it was not easy then. And Lincoln, we look at him today and say he wasn't so attractive. But there was actually a portrait that was taken by Matthew Brady in 1860 when Lincoln visited New York. And Lincoln looks pretty good in that picture. And that picture was the one picture, the one image of Lincoln that Americans had. And Lincoln credited that picture as one of the things that helped him get elected in the 1860 election. So there wasn't this widespread notion that we have today, oh, God, Lincoln was not such a good-looking guy, face made for radio kind of thing. But so I think image is always important to some degree, but it's clearly more important when you see somebody's face plastered all over the place. And, I worked on the Romney campaign a little bit, and I remember my reaction when I met Mitt Romney for the first time was, wow, this is a really good-looking guy. I mean, it just kind of radiates from him, and he was impressively good-looking. It obviously didn't get him elected, but I think it does help to be a good-looking guy. And you look at our recent presidents. So George Bush was a good-looking guy. Obama's a good-looking guy. So there is that aspect to it. But I think the American people are looking for ideas and substance as well. And so I think there's more to it than just that image. Now, in terms of rating presidents who are good at what they do, I think Lincoln was very good. He was a huge reader in his youth, and I have a whole chapter where I talk about Lincoln and especially how he had even more trouble getting books than Adams and Jefferson. So books were still expensive, but he had very little access to them. He wasn't in a major metropolitan area. He was from a poor family, but he still made Herculean efforts to get any books he could get his hands on. And you've all heard stories about him walking 16 miles in the snow or whatever to get the nearest book. But he had a few books in a collection that he read over and over and over again, including the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, which he basically memorized. And he used the ideas in those books to inform his thinking. So, for example, on Aesop's Fables, he learned from that this notion of speaking in stories, of telling parables to make his point. He became very, very good at that. So I think he was good at the culture they had at the time. I don't think I can answer this question by just picking one president. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was also quite good, and I think he would have had some trouble today because his voice was not a great voice. It was kind of a high-pitched squeal or whine. But But he was a huge reader, read 2 to 3 books a night in the White House while he was president, which is an impressive number. And he had this trick of he would reach out to authors of books that impressed him, and he would bring in those people as advisors to him. So Jacob Riis, who wrote about poverty in New York, was someone that he interacted with. Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote a book about sea power, was someone who he reached out to after reading his book, and then relied on his ideas throughout his career. So he was skillful at using cultural figures and bringing them in. I talk a lot about that in the book. So I think he was good. And he became a cultural phenomenon. His image was used to sell all kinds of products, often without his permission. And in fact, we still have today the teddy bear, which is named after Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was very good. And then in the recent era, I got to say, I voted against the guy twice. I was not a big fan. But Bill Clinton, I was quite impressed with his use of culture. I mean, I mentioned that Arsenio Hall moment in 1992, which was really groundbreaking. Nobody had done that kind of thing before, because he not only did that sax performance with the sunglasses, but then he sat down and talked to Arsenio about issues for a half hour afterwards, and that really was impressive. But Clinton was very good at the movie references. He was good at musical references. In fact, his daughter Chelsea is named after the famous song Chelsea Morning. But he was a serious reader. He read substantive books, and he made references to those books, and people talked about how wonky he was in algebra. And he had this little trick where he would leave a serious book he was reading on the corner of his desk at the Oval Office, and when reporters came in, they might note it and then write, oh, he's reading Stephen Carter's book, The Culture of Disbelief, which they in fact did. And so that not only made him look substantive, but also made a guy like Stephen Carter, who's a prolific writer, favorably inclined to say nice things about Clinton. So it was a very clever trick. So I think Clinton was quite good in that capacity. And in fact, he understood what I call in the book this filtration effect, that I don't really know, and none of us really know what presidents read. We know what they tell us they're reading. So he would highlight the substantive nonfiction books he was reading, but he was also a big mystery lover. He would read sometimes 3 to 4 mysteries a week. He didn't watch TV at night. He sat and read mysteries. He wasn't highlighting that. He was highlighting the fact that he was reading serious nonfiction books. So I think those were 3 presidents I'd point to. Good question.
Got another question, and then we'll go over here. It seems like liberal-leaning presidents, particularly in the television age, have had a bit of an easier go of it. You've noted that in your book somewhat. And you note kind of the typical treatment, say on Saturday Night Live, of Republican presidents or candidates. They tend to go towards either they're dumb or they're evil, or maybe both.
Yeah.
But usually they pick one theme or the other. How do you see conservatives trying to counteract that, or what means can they use to try to overcome that handicap?
Right. Well, clearly you're right that in recent years, Republicans have had a disadvantage and Democrats an advantage. So Obama and Clinton, I think, were pretty good at use of pop culture, and nobody thinks of George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush as great pop culture users. But Ronald Reagan was a great pop culture user. So I'm not saying that Republicans can't play on that playing field. However, there is this phenomenon that I talk about in the book, that when a Democrat praises a show, they get feted by the producers and the creators and the writers of that show, and they might actually have post a fundraiser for them and tweet how great it is the president likes my show. Whereas when a Republican likes a show or a song, as we've seen many times, they get pilloried for that. So when Reagan tried to use Born in the USA, the Springsteen song, in his '84 campaign, Springsteen said, well, Reagan's campaign theme was "It's Morning in America." Springsteen got up there and said, "It's not morning in Pittsburgh." And then you had George H.W. Bush try to use that song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy" by Bobby McFerrin, which I don't know why he would use that song anyway, but McFerrin told him not to use that. So that's a constant phenomenon when Republicans try and use pop culture. And even in this last election, Obama said nice things about Modern Family. He said that Michelle and the girls love to watch the show, and they did a fundraiser for him. And Ann Romney said that they like Modern Family, and they got a nasty tweet from the show's creator, Stephen Levitan, saying, well, maybe when you guys support gay marriage, we'll have you on the show, or something like that. So that is a problem, and Republicans kind of are fighting uphill on that front. That said, there are ways Republicans can address this issue. And so you had the Duck Dynasty situation in Louisiana, where the candidate that had the Duck Dynasty guys embraced them did well. In fact, I was in a meeting with Governor Jindal yesterday, and I asked him about the show True Detective, which was which is a Louisiana-based show. And he said he didn't watch it, but he did watch Duck Dynasty, and he said you could never go wrong quoting Duck Dynasty in Louisiana. So, I mean, there are shows that appeal in different parts that are helpful. And NASCAR, for example, is a cultural phenomenon that definitely gives Republicans an advantage and not Democrats, and Democrats who go there often get booed. So I think if Republicans are smart and targeted about it, they can use the pop culture, recognizing that they are at a bit of a disadvantage in the playing field.
So, hand down here.
In terms of
If you can wait for the microphone for our online viewers, thank you.
in terms of future elections, our generation has no qualms about putting anything and everything online. And so I'm wondering, in 10, 15 years, with the popularity of social media sites growing, how are future candidates going to be taken seriously when their entire adolescence can be found online for public viewing?
It's a great question and a real issue. I know this person who, in the 1980s, we used to joke about him that he was always concerned about his paper trail. And he saw the Bork hearings, and he didn't want to write anything controversial. And he actually did very well getting a senior post in the Justice Department under Bush, in large part because he was careful about his paper trail. So I think smart, strategic people can think about it at an early age and avoid that problem. That said, obviously not everyone's going to do that, and you have to recognize that your Twitter feed can be a vulnerability. When I worked on the Romney campaign, for example, they gave us a little briefing where they said, you can't use social media while you're doing this. Just, you're done. Don't use it at all. I remember this one young woman who's about 22 said, really, I can't even tweet that it's a nice day outside? So there are a lot of people who have this kind of need to share their feelings and their thoughts, and it is dangerous, and it can be a real problem for not only candidates, but people looking for jobs in the future. So I urge all those young people out there watching online and your smartphones to think very carefully about what you put on Facebook and Twitter, because it never, ever goes away. Good question.
We'll go in the very back here.
There's also a guy behind the pillar.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for your presentation and for taking the time to do the research that went into this book. I recently read...
Thank you for that. You're the first person to thank me for the research, so I appreciate that.
You are at Heritage.
Yeah, good question.
I
Good point.
recently read Marco Rubio's autobiography. He talks about the lead up to the 2010 Senate campaigning throughout Florida, appearing on Telemundo and several different Spanish-speaking audiences, which he thinks really pushed him over the edge and helped him win the election. How long do you think it'll be before a president has to cater to a national audience and minimum will be bilingual or speak several different languages?
That's a good question, and I note with interest that that Rubio went on the Hugh Hewitt show yesterday and was criticizing Spanish media, including Univision and Telemundo, for their very heavy leftward drift. So I think that's a good point. It'd be interesting to compare those comments to his use of Telemundo in 2010. Look, I think it's already seen as an advantage. I mean, George W. Bush used to speak Spanish, not incredibly well, but he used to speak Spanish in his races as governor and race for president. When people talk about Jeb Bush and the possibility of him running, you constantly hear, well, he speaks fluent Spanish and his wife is of Hispanic descent. So I think we're already at the point where it's an advantage. And you hear about people like Cruz and Rubio, and that their heritage might be a benefit. But I don't think that's a completely new phenomenon. I mean, in 1960, people were excited that Kennedy was a Catholic, and it had some advantages, it had some disadvantages. But I think who you are is a part of who you campaign as. So I think that's a constant thing. But we'll see the linguistic trends and see what percentage of voters speak other languages other than English. Obviously, Spanish right now is the lead alternative language. But I think in the 2004 campaign, I was working with Bush, and he got about 41% of the Hispanic vote. Now, you get 41% of the vote, that means you lose 59% of it. So you got to recognize he did not win the Hispanic vote by any stretch of the imagination. But it was seen as a huge victory, because the way you win an election is you get your voters out and have them vote overwhelmingly for you, and you limit the overwhelming edge that the expected voters for the other side get. And so I was particularly surprised in the 2012 election that Romney got a higher percentage of Jewish voters than he did of Hispanic voters. That never happens. I mean, the Jewish voters are a reliably liberal constituency, myself excluded. But so that was surprising, and I think it's something that Republicans just have to deal with.
There's one behind the pillar there.
Adam Brickley with Heritage. I was wondering how you think the perception of the American presidency is evolving as it kind of walks the tightrope between being a regal office and a political one. And an example I was thinking of is the Prime Minister of Canada a couple years ago made great political hay out of not only taking a guest role on a TV show called Murdoch Mysteries, but appearing in the role of a buffoon who failed to recognize the sitting Prime Minister of Canada when he walked into the police station. I'm not sure Barack Obama would get the same positive effect from appearing as the court jester on Game of Thrones, so I'm trying to think how you think the American presidency is perceived going forward.
Yeah, you know, Game of Thrones did have a presidential appearance, though. It was when a character was decapitated, they used a fake head of George W. Bush. So there's that Hollywood bias for you. The question of how presidents are perceived in presidential dignity, I think, is a really important one, and something that I worry about. It is an important, august office, and we need to maintain a level of dignity and stature for the role. At the same time, and I mentioned this earlier, with this notion of the common man, you've got to get elected. You've got to relate to people. People have to understand that you have their concerns at heart. And it's a difficult line to balance. Now, I think President Obama has been successful politically. I think he's gone over too far to the side of relating to the common man with his TV watching. Maybe President Bush was a little too remote in his, wasn't a big fan of pop culture, didn't really watch entertainment shows. However, he had that kind of cowboy thing going. That's how he related to the American people. So presidents have to find some way to connect, and there are different ways to do it. But I think if you fail to do it, you will not be successful. But you must do it in a way that maintains presidential dignity and stature, and it's a tough thing to do.
We have time for one more. Why don't we go here to the front row?
Colette Prayer from Heritage. I would take off on the last question. Not so much the choice of the president of how he wants to present himself, but the venue that he has to use. I'm thinking of with the upcoming importance of reaching younger and younger, generations of voters. And I heard some statistic on how many young voters get their news from The Daily Show.
It's frightening.
So I forget, it would shock me, I don't know what it was, but it's not completely in their control how they want to present themselves, because certain venues are the only option they have to reach some people.
Look, it's a dangerous thing when large percentages of young people get their news from a fake news show. I mean, it is not a real news show. Now, he's very funny and he's very talented. He's very good at what he does. And I watch clips of it, and I'm always amazed at how much he can get done with just an eye roll, or how much he gets done just with his gestures and the expectation that his audience has that he will be funny, that lets him be funny. So it's not even the writing itself sometimes. It's just that he's got this groundswell of expectation that he will be funny that helps make him successful. Look, I'm a fan of the informed voter. I would like to see voters be better informed, but you can't mandate that. You can't force it. I said in the late 18th century, American voters, the American people, were much better read than their counterparts in other countries. I don't believe that is the case today. If you look at comparing us to some of the, especially the northern European countries. But if we are going to have a successful republic where people go out there and vote, we need informed voters in order to make educated decisions. And watching The Daily Show, while entertaining and while I do it, is not going to get you there.
All right, well, we've reached the conclusion of our time. I know that we have books available for sale, and Tevi's agreed also to sign books here up at front if you'd like to do that. And please join me in thanking Tevi for being here.